Hey everybody. This is the I believe second. No, not I believe. I know this is the second chapter from Marx and Marxism by Iring Fetscher. The title of this chapter is "Liberal, Democratic, and Marxist Concepts of Freedom." So, Section 1. Two established theories of the freedom of the individual in society were available to the young Marx: the liberal concept, which was formulated in the most significant philosophical terms by Kant and Hegel's metaphysics of freedom. In concrete historical terms, both theories seem to lend expression to a specific form of social and political reality and its limitations. The theory and political will of Marx arose out of the attempt to overcome the limitations of these two concepts, their complementary abstraction on the notional and practical levels. It is therefore impossible properly to understand the political objectives of Marxism in its original form without first examining the two, quote, bourgeois theories of freedom, end quote, which Marx fought against by analyzing their biased nature. For Kant, the principle of political freedom resides in the fact that, quote, no man can force me to be happy in his particular way, bracket, i.e. in the way in which he conceives the happiness of other men, end bracket. That was from Iring Fetscher. Everyone is entitled to seek happiness in whatever manner seems best to him, provided that he does not interfere with the freedom of others to strive towards the same objective, which can coexist with the freedom of everyone else under a conceivable general law, end quote. Kant. Freedom is therefore the amount of elbow room the individual has to seek happiness, and his freedom is limited by the equally legitimate search for other individuals for happiness. The inadequacy of this concept obviously lies in the fact that it views my fellow men in purely negative terms as the inevitable limit to my own arbitrary action, which the law requires me to respect. And yet we are bound to arrive at this conclusion if we take as our initial hypotheses the assumption of Hobbes and Kant that the, quote, asocial sociality, end quote, of man is an immutable fact. If man is defined as spontaneously, by his very nature, an enemy of man's fellows, who is willing to respect the claim of others to freedom only because the established order of the state compels him to heed the voice of his conscience? The only possible relationship between man and man's fellows is negative and restrictive. For Marx, however, this antagonism between individuals, which had been considered, quote, natural, end quote, since Hobbes, is merely a characteristic of competitive capitalist society. Jean-Jacques Rousseau preceded him in the recognition that this mutual enmity, quote, homo homini lupus, end quote, this quote, homo homini lupus, unquote, is rooted in historical circumstances. He states that Hobbes' assumptions could be legitimately applied only to contemporary man and not to man per se. Footnote. Rousseau's statement in the fragment État de guerre, quote, Hobbes' mistake, ... is to confuse natural man with the men he knows, end quote. Rousseau. That is actually a very good, I actually really like that brief formulation. I think that kind of like, I think that's a very good critique of like the, I don't know, I can't really actually think of the word for it. There's a lot of times within like social science and stuff, you'll see like people talk about like what is using what is empirically observable, as like a source of like transhistorical knowledge. And I think that quotation from Rousseau is a very pithy, snappy way of critiquing that. Anyway, in his Political Theory of Possessive Individualism, published in 1962, C.B. Macpherson has elaborated a convincing statement of the relationship between political theory from Hobbes to Locke and the model of an antagonistic market society. End footnote. Unlike Rousseau, however, Marx sees that in all societies the free development of the human individual is associated with the active cooperation of all other individuals, a fact that has become abundantly clear as never before in our modern society with its high degree of specialization and division of labor, whereas Rousseau wished to turn the clock back from the market society with the market society's division of labor to a pre-capitalistic community made up of peasant craftsmen with the maximum degree of autonomy in which the continuous struggle of competition and the dependence of each individual on all others would be abolished. Marx looked to the future, to a highly developed cooperative civilization in which each individual willingly devotes himself wholeheartedly to the satisfaction of others, in which everyone else understands and accepts this devotion as a contribution towards his own satisfaction, instead of abolishing or relaxing the relations between men as Rousseau would ideally have done. Marx seeks to render such relations universal while at the same time radically changing such relations' nature. However, Marx was not the first to sense the limitations of Kant's liberal concept of the state. While Kant was a theoretician of the liberal constitutional state, whose function is limited to ensuring the peaceful coexistence of individuals who are by nature egoistic and who never become completely moral beings even within it, Hegel looks for the freedom of the rational citizen in the community of the state itself, rather than in the degree of liberty accorded to the individual within the legal order. In his philosophy of world history, Hegel speaks out specifically against this liberal concept of freedom and condemns this liberal concept of freedom, as Marx was to do later, as purely, quote, negative and formal. The state is, quote, not merely a conjunction of human beings in which the freedom of all individuals must be limited. Freedom is conceived in purely negative terms by the theory which proposes that each individual must limit his freedom in relation to others in such a way that this common limitation, this mutual interference, leaves a small place for each man to do as he pleases, end quote. In his Jena Real philosophy, Hegel already states that, quote, formal freedom, end quote, is that type of freedom which, quote, has its substance outside itself, end quote. For Hegel, the substance of freedom is, quote, spirit, end quote, or more precisely, the objective spirit living in the institutions and in the laws of the rational state. Even if this idea is confused by idealistic trimmings and mystification, Marx sees it as a significant step forward from Kant's position. Quote, substance, end quote, must simply be understood in concrete terms as the real society of cooperating men, through which alone an individual can develop his humanity. It is true that for Hegel the positive relationship between the individual and the totality of his fellow men, of his state, becomes a pure ideal identification of the, quote, subjective spirit, end quote, of the individual with the, quote, objective spirit, end quote, of the state as a whole. The dialectical identification, which does not exclude the independent existence of two related poles, remains for Hegel simply an identification of ideal values. Real man and the real, quote, bourgeois society, end quote, Hegel's, quote, state of necessity and understanding, end quote, remain an unessential appearance far below this high sphere. Basically, Hegel has simply exchanged one abstraction for another abstraction, whereas the liberal notion of freedom makes an abstraction from the positive relationship of man to man's fellows because it sees in this relationship a reason for the lack of freedom, which in fact also corresponds entirely to the actual condition and mental structure of men in a competitive society. Hegel's metaphysics of the state abstracts in the reverse direction from this reality. It justly attacks the, quote, lack of substance, end quote, of formal freedom, but is able to offer concrete man only a substance which lies in a pale ideal condition beyond everyday reality as he knows it. Although Hegel asserts that the state is, quote, the reality in which the individual has his freedom, end quote, for living man, the human environment is not the ideal state, but, quote, bourgeois society, end quote, as it exists, the world of production, trade, and acquisition in which he must seek and maintain his concrete freedom. Section 2. In Marx's critique of the two concepts of freedom, the liberal concept is shown to be conditioned by historical circumstances and trapped within the limited socio-political horizon of bourgeois thought, while the Hegelian concept is dismissed as having an illusory and complementary character when seen against the reality of the unchanged bourgeois society. The most detailed criticism of bourgeois theories of freedom and human rights is to be found in Capital. Quote, the sphere of circulation and exchange of commodities within which labor is bought and sold was in reality a paradise of innate human rights. governed entirely by freedom, equality, property, and Bentham. Freedom, because the buyer and sellers of a commodity such as labor power are constrained only according to their own free will. The buyers and sellers of a commodity such as labor power enter into a contract as freely and legally equal agents. The contract is the final result in which the buyers and sellers of a commodity's common free will is given common legal expression. Equality, because of the buyers and sellers of commodities' relationships with one another are purely those of the owners of commodities, and they exchange like for like. Property, because each individual makes use only of what belongs to that individual. Bentham, because each of the two thinks only of himself. The only power which holds them together and establishes a relationship between them is their egotism, personal advantage, and private interest, and precisely because each individual thinks of himself and never of anyone else, they all work towards their mutual advantage, the general good and common interest, in accordance with a pre-established harmony of things, or under the auspices of a cunning knowing providence." End quote. Marx, Capital. The freedom and equality, equal freedom, which are guaranteed in the fundamental rights of the French Constitution and taken over in a similar manner by all liberal democratic constitutions, are felt by Marx to be an adequate expression of the relationships between men in a market society. Freedom is the expression of the fact that there are no relationships of dependence determined by privileges of birth, but on the contrary, that each person as a commodity owner can dispose freely of a commodity which, quote, belongs, end quote, to him, and is simply bound to honor contracts to which he himself gave his agreement. But the fallacy of this apparent equality and freedom is shown in the example quoted by Marx. The real inequality in possessions is reflected in the real, if not legally imposed, need of individuals with nothing else to sell, to market their own labor power, so that they are compelled to hire themselves out. But labor power is not like the finished products which a craftsman offers in the marketplace, a partial objectification of the craftsman's being. Labor power is this objectifying capacity itself. And since the essence of man consists in the ability to reshape creatively nature around him so as to adapt it to human wishes and aims, the individual who is forced to sell his ability is robbed of his own humanity and thus alienated from mankind and humanity. The limitation of the liberal concept of freedom is also apparent, as we mentioned earlier, in the fact that it considers individuals solely as selfish beings who calculate their own personal advantage, whereas in reality these characteristics are restricted to men in a competitive society and may well be absent in earlier and in future ages. Marx's critique in Capital is still, however, remotely reminiscent of Hegel. He too made the criticism that the true moral objective, the good of the community as a whole, is in a bourgeois competitive society simply brought about, quote, behind the back of the individual, end quote, or as Adam Smith said, by a, quote, invisible hand, end quote, whereas reasonable moral individuals should try to work consciously towards this aim. Whether an individual is actually able to be free and enjoy at least a relative measure of happiness in this bourgeois competitive society depends on many chance factors. The chance of birth, inheritance, inborn skills, and so on. That is why the notion of happiness is associated with the idea of chance in the consciousness of the members of such societies, and why games in which, quote, success, end quote, is dependent solely on the laws of probability are referred to as, quote, games of chance, end quote. In German, the same word means both, quote, chance and, quote, happiness, end quote. It was possible to accept the dependence of the freedom and happiness of each individual on, quote, destiny, end quote, as long as this, quote, fate, end quote, was considered as a natural necessity or defined decision against which human efforts were powerless. But once this, quote, chance, end quote, is recognized on the whole as the natural expression of certain laws created by the blind interaction of men themselves, however great man's resignation may be, he cannot accept destiny, and compliance with the fate determined by other men is experienced as an inhuman regression from the degree of human freedom and responsibility which it is objectively possible to achieve. At a time when dependence on nature is diminishing rapidly and dependence on the, quote, destiny, end quote, which men reserve for their fellows is increasing, the glorification of fate and destiny is simply one means of evading troublesome responsibilities. talk of a, quote, destiny, end quote, conceals behind what appears on the surface as chance has the advantage of greater insight by comparison with a blindness to underlying necessities, but prevents this insight from being put to good use by demanding resignation from practice and acceptance of the inevitable, which is more mystified as, quote, the essence of being, end quote, or, quote, being as such, end quote. Marx views Hegel's metaphysics of the state as the other complementary form of the abstract concept of freedom. In its idealized German form, it is the theory of bourgeois democracy already expressed directly in the text of the Constitution of the French Revolution. For Marx, therefore, the critique of Hegel's philosophy of law and the state also has the significance of a confrontation with the bourgeois democratic state itself, which he as a German considers first, not by chance, only in its theoretical, ideological form. The advantage of Hegel's concept over the liberal concept consisted, as we have already seen, in its ability to consider the dialectical relationship of the individual to society. We find the same realization in Marx, where Marx derived it from Hegel or from his own experience of social reality. Quote, above all, we must avoid fixing, quote, society, end quote, as an abstraction in relation to the individual. The individual is the social being, the individual's expression of life, even if the individual's expression of life does not appear in the direct form of common expression made in the company of others, is therefore an expression and a confirmation of social life, end quote, Marx. However, the flaw in Hegel's concept is that Hegel considers both the individual and society in a purely idealized and abstract form as subjective and objective spirit, while the concrete living man and bourgeois society are kept in their subordinate positions in which the conditions described by the liberals continue to prevail. Man as a communal being hovers in an illusory and imaginary sphere beyond the individual of bourgeois society, with his calculated understanding, his private egotism, his work, possessions, and competitive struggle, and under the domination of that, quote, cunning reason, end quote, which Adam Smith and Mandeville had revealed to Hegel. However, the abstraction of Hegelian philosophy from concrete daily life is not accidental. Quote, the German concept of the modern state abstracting from natural man, end quote, was only, quote, possible because and to the extent that the modern state itself abstracts from real man or satisfies the whole man only in an imaginary way, end quote. Marx. In this, quote, modern state, end quote, man lives only in his abstract form as a citizen, citoyen. I don't know, I'm going to actually look that up because I've never actually done that, but I need to look up how to say that spelling. Is it citoyen or is Y operating as a Z in French? Let's see.
Citoyen. Citoyen.
Citoyen. Huh. In this, quote, modern state, end quote, man lives only in man's abstract form as a citizen. Citoyen. Citoyen.
Citoyen. Citoyen.
Citoyen. Yuan. I don't know how to say it. Oh well. While at the same time, in man's real physical existence, man remains a member of a competitive bourgeois society. As a citizen, man may well feel ties with the community of other citizens, but in his real physical existence, man is as unfree as man is unsociable because man is subject to external laws, quote, chance, end quote, and can have only negative relationships with fellow men as competitors or as, quote, means, end quote. Quote, the fully developed political state, end quote, wrote Marx in 1834, constitutes essentially the species life of man as opposed to man's material life. All the conditions of his egotistic material life remain outside the sphere of the state in a bourgeois society. When the political state has reached the political state's true level of development, man leads not only in his thoughts and consciousness, but in reality a double life. A heavenly and an earthly life in the political community where he is and counts as a communal being, and life in a bourgeois society where man acts as a private being who considers other men as means, denigrates himself to a means, and becomes the plaything of external forces, end quote. The, quote, true life, end quote, of man is life among his fellow human beings in community with his fellow human beings, so that each individual complements and enriches the other. But in the modern world, this, quote, true life, end quote, exists only in the illusory and transcendental form of the community of citizens, and achieves a certain degree of reality only during war, when the common efforts are directed in a wholehearted enmity against the community of citizens of other states. Footnote. This consequence was deduced by Hegel, who demonstrated in his philosophy of right the higher morality of the idealistic concept of the state by comparison with bourgeois society precisely in regard to this specific point. Quote, it is a grave miscalculation if, the state is simply considered as a civil society with the security of the life and property of individuals as the state's ultimate aim, end quote. Quote, here lies the moral aspect of war, which cannot be considered, as an absolute evil, end quote. Quote, war is the state of affairs in which the vanity of temporal goods and affairs is dealt with, seriously is, the moment in which the ideality of the particular achieves its right and becomes reality, bracket, in this context, Hegel's term, quote, ideality, end quote, means that which is destined to be transcended. In this context, Hegel's term, quote, ideality means that which is destined to be transcended, end bracket. It has the higher significance that through it, the moral health of a nation is preserved in their indifference to the fixation of finite conditions, just as the motion of the winds preserves the sea from putridity, end quote. Rex Philosophy, page 324, Werke, Jubiläumsgabe. Hegel found empirical confirmation of his philosophical deduction of the utility of foreign wars in the fact that, quote, successful wars have prevented internal unrest and consolidated the domestic power of the state, end quote. Hegel, end footnote. In their real daily existence, on the other hand, individuals lead a, quote, false, end quote, life, a life of intentional detachment from and enmity against their fellows. Quote, real man is recognized here only in the form of egotistic, bracket, untrue, Iring Fetscher, end bracket, individual, true man only in the form of an abstract citizen, end quote. I'm not sure that quote is from. I think it's from Marx. Sorry, that's why I paused. The task to be deduced from this analysis is therefore the conversion of the real untrue man of bourgeois society into a true person consciously working together with his fellows. In the still philosophical language of Marx's early writings, this idea is expressed as follows, quote, not until the true individual man absorbs the abstract citizen into himself and becomes a species being in his individual capacity, in his empirical life, individual work, and individual relationships, not until he ceases to isolate his forces propres, or his forces propre, as a social force in the form of political strength, not until then will complete emancipation be achieved, end quote. Marx. Marx's notion of man who has at last achieved his concrete freedom, end quote, has become a species being in his individual work and individual relationships, end quote, is described in greater detail in the works of the 1840s and 50s, in particular in his Excerpt, Tefta, and Grundrisse. Man is a, quote, species being, end quote, when he ceases to project his species characteristics, as is the case with religious objectification according to Feuerbach, onto a supernatural being, or to subject himself through political alienation to a, quote, state, end quote, situated beyond and above everyday bourgeois life. According to the possibilities with which nature has endowed him, each individual must appropriate in a universal way the humanizing work achieved by men living before and with him. Only when he is freed from the, quote, idiocy, end quote, of lifelong involvement in a profession and from the slavery of wage earning will his universal appropriation of the common productive life of the species be possible for the individual. And only when this condition has been achieved can the state and religious ideology as a necessary complement of the imperfect reality of society and alienating work wither away. On a superficial level of analysis, the elimination of the necessity of the state is associated with the removal of class privileges. When these class privileges become superfluous, there is no longer any need for forcible maintenance of these privileges vis-a-vis the underprivileged. However, the indispensability of the fully democratic state is additionally linked with the development of a society in which individuals become, quote, species, that is, communal beings, end quote, and enjoy a wholly positive relationship with their fellow men. Individuals must be held in check in the, quote, political state, end quote, as long as there is a real inequality in the possibilities of individual development and the, quote, alienation, end quote, of everyone has not been overcome. A step in this direction is taken by the elimination of privileged ownership, but the ultimate objective is still far from achieved. Until working hours can be reduced to such an extent that all the necessary tasks are done voluntarily by everyone and the productivity of all is sufficient to enable each individual to fulfill his requirements, inequality remains in the real possibilities of enjoyment, and hence individuals are not completely, quote, free, end quote. While the satisfaction of my needs is not determined by my claims as a man, my tastes and interests, and so on, but instead by my purse or even by the socially useful work which I am able to perform, and this is generally the case even in the, quote, socialist, end quote, countries, there can be no question of the human relationships of which the young Marx spoke being achieved. In his Excerpts EFTA on Economics, written in 1844 and 1845, Marx developed the image of an alienating merchandise-producing society as opposed to the future non-alienated human society. These formulations enable us to understand most easily that Marx had in mind the notion of, quote, what Marx had in mind in the notion of, quote, human emancipation, end quote, the liberation of real man. The division of labor in a technical sense is a prerequisite in both forms of society, but in one it is associated with the egotistical isolation of each individual, and in the other with a relationship of love between all members of society. Marx gives the following description of capitalist manufacturing society, quote, I have produced for myself and not for you, just as you have produced for yourself and not for me. The result of my production has in itself as little connection with you as the result of your production has a direct connection with me. In other words, our production is not a production by man for man as man. That is, our production is not by a social, bracket, by which is meant consciously intended for society, for other men, end bracket, form of production. None of us as man has a relationship of enjoyment with the product of others. As men we are unexisting for the production of each of us. Our exchange, bracket, which is determined by the market and by money, Iring, Fetscher, end bracket, cannot therefore be the mediating movement confirming that my production is for your benefit, since our exchange is an objectification of our own being and requirements. The fact of our joint existence as human beings does not provide the link in our production for each other, ... end quote. Marx. Here it is maintained that in a simple barter society, and far more so in a state of fully developed capitalism, the general dependence of each individual on the range of products of divided labor does not take the form of voluntary cheerful work of each individual for the benefit of others as an objectification of the, quote, human essence, end quote, for the human requirements of other men, but is an egotistic form of work by each individual which indirectly, through the need to exchange on the open market, becomes production for the other persons, not specifically as human beings, but as, quote, buyers who have the money to pay, end quote. Every product manufactured by a man or group of men in accordance with the, quote, laws of beauty, end quote, and other rules which are specific to men correspond to and meets the human need for other men. Great poetry is written for people who understand poetry, a symphony composed for the musical ear, and a painting produced for people of good taste. However, the possibility of reading a poem, listening to a symphony, and seeing a painting is not determined by man's own taste, but rather the amount of money which man has at his disposal. The products which we have just mentioned are not there for me or you as, quote, human beings, end quote, but only to the extent that we have enough money. They are not therefore created for us, but for our money, not for communal man as species, but for the objectivized concept of an inhuman society, money. In a truly human society in which individuals would not be barriers to each other's freedom, would supplement and enrich one another's being, the following description would apply. Quote, assuming that we are producers as human beings, each of us would then have doubly asserted himself and others through his production. 1. In my production, I would have objectified my individuality in my individuality's uniqueness and therefore enjoyed an individual expression of life during the actual activity, while also experiencing the individual pleasure of seeing my own personality expressed as an objective perceptible force through what I produce. 2. In your enjoyment or use of my product, I would have had the direct satisfaction of the awareness of having satisfied a human need through my work and of having expressed human nature objectively and having created an object to meet the requirement of another human being. 3. I would have had the satisfaction of having acted as the intermediary between you and the human species, that is, of your feeling me to be a completion of your own being and a necessary part of yourself, that is, I would know my value to be confirmed in your thought and love. 4. Through my individual expression of life, I would have created directly your expression of life, that is, my own true being in essence would be confirmed and embodied in my individual activity. Our products would then be so many mirrors from which our being would shine out to us, ... end quote. Marx. Here at last the evil spell of the society of commodity production and exchange based on egotism is broken, and quite apart from the real change in the nature of work, which loses work's burdensome character because of the technical advances and reduction in working hours, the varied world of human products is changed from a distorting mirror in which alienated man meets alienated man's own image in the form of reified commodities into the mirror of true sociable humanity. The work of all men would therefore be related to the needs of others in the same way as the activity of a lover who composes a song for his beloved to sing. Section 3. Marx was not a dreamer who imagined that this human world could become reality overnight, but I am convinced that in spite of the cautious statements which Marx made on several occasions in later life, he did not depart from his belief that true humanity could be achieved. Admittedly, the mastery which men could achieve over nature by working together, as well as an increase in labor productivity, are necessary prerequisites for this emancipation from the alienated and reified world, but they cannot in themselves bring about this emancipation. At no time did Marx consider the meaning of history, and the essence of that liberation to which socialism could lead lay simply in an increase in man's control over nature around him. One is tempted to quote from the Bible here, quote, "What does it profit man if he gains the whole world and loses his soul?" End quote. I guess that's a quote from the Bible. For Marx, too, complete mastery of nature would be of little value unless complete mastery over nature became the basis of that society in which men shape nature for their own common purposes. The objective of his socialism is not to work, quote, against nature, end quote, through mastery over nature, but, quote, for all men, end quote, by eliminating selfishness and man's domination over his fellows. But until such time as freedom and happiness become a concrete reality, the two abstract concepts of freedom retain an immediate significance. In spite of the critical reservations which we have encountered, every state, even a socialist state, necessarily contains a measure of democratic metaphysics and of indispensable ideology. To the extent that each individual's contribution is not exclusively based on a joyful spontaneity and love for his fellow man, but on, quote, material self-interest, end quote, the image of a transcendent community, the state must arise as the complement of a still asocial society. but it must never be identified with a community which will one day unite men working in harmony for their mutual benefit. Every state, including the people's democracies, remains a, quote, illusory community, end quote, which can, quote, become superfluous, end quote, wither away, end quote, only when a true community in the sense outlined by Marx has come into being. During this long transitional period, the liberal concept expressed in Kant's classic formulation retains its relative significance as well. It appeared to be necessary and justified because it ensured a measure of freedom for the egotistic and unsociable individual. This is best achieved in practical terms when an existing legal order determines the degree of freedom of the individual, not only in relation to other individuals, but in relation to the superior force of the executive machinery of the state. The liberal ideology, which suggests that the maximum possible degree of freedom has been reached when each individual is assured his own limited measure of freedom of action, must surely be rejected. The limited and abstract nature of this concept of freedom has been clearly emphasized by Hegel and Marx. However, as long as the human society which Marx described has not been achieved, and even in the socialist states, the majority of, if not all, individuals continue to be impelled by egotistic motives in performing the individual's work, the liberal safeguards remain indispensable. They have to be supplemented by measures which enable the individual to make use of the freedom guaranteed by law, education, medical care, recreation facilities, general security of life. But they will always be necessary as long as competitive envy and real inequality remain essential traits of a society. Provided that an appropriate interpretation is given to Kant's formula, it will be possible to prevent this freedom from being misused. The freedom to place other men in a state of economic slavery is not a form of action compatible with, quote, the freedom of each individual according to a general law, end quote. It follows that so long as concrete freedom has not been achieved, the two complementary abstract forms of freedom retain their historically limited justification. The end. Thanks for listening.